Hey folks, okay, this time around I want to run through the basics for Lab 2. Again, we'll have a couple of weeks for this, so I'll do a kind of general intro today, and then maybe we'll talk about some other gory details in the session next week. So for this one, the focus is mostly on lists and recursion. So we're going to take a couple of different sort of data formats and store them in lists and translate between the two of them and check formats are valid. And so lots of practice with, again, type checking, recursion, lists. Um, Ideally, maybe you can try out some tail recursive versions of this. It's not required for the lab, but any practice you can get with that is good. So I'm going to run through the specs here. I'll talk about the different data types that we're going to try and represent and the functions that we're going to try and create. So the idea is we're going to have two different sort of data formats where we're storing information about jobs and employees in lists. So one of them is just going to be a list of pairs where we give an employee, each pair has an employee name and a job ID, so a positive integer. So it might be, like Fred 3, Shaggy 2, whatever. So a string for the person's name and an integer for the ID of the job that they're supposed to be doing. So a person can get assigned a whole bunch of different jobs. And so we're going to have a second format that's a list of all of the jobs assigned to one person. So again, it might be Fred 10, 12, 17, 8 type of thing. So we're going to have these two different formats. One that's just a whole bunch of pairs. This person gets this job, this person gets this job, this person gets this job, and then another one that's this person gets job, 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 job. And so so they are going to be these lists of lists. So the names aren't terribly creative. Job list is the list of pairs where it's person job, person job, person job, person job, and job summary is the kind of summary lists for the different employees. So again, Fred 2, 4, 5, 6, Shaggy 1, 2, 3, 4 type of thing. I should try and avoid overlap there, but again, that's the idea. So what you're going to be doing is building four different functions. One to check that job list has the correct format and return true or false. True if it's valid, false if it's not. One to check if a job summary has a valid format. Again, returns true if it's okay, nil if it's not. And then two functions to convert between them. So one of them, JList to sum, takes a job list, so the list of pairs, and returns it in the summary, returns the equivalent in the summary format. And the other one takes the summary format and returns the equivalent kind of list of pairs. So those are the four that you're required to implement, and you're going to be providing those in lab2.cl. And so there's skeleton versions of them in the lab2.cl that's in the repository that you're going to be forking and cloning. You can add helper functions if you want to in that lab2.cl, but any testing that you want to do, I'm going to get you to do from a separate file. So essentially, lab2.cl is just going to be those four functions and any helper functions that are absolutely necessary for them. No other global variables, no other testing stuff. We'll put all of that into, there's a separate test2.cl in the repository that you can use to load and test the functions in lab2.cl. So again, that one's just for the four functions and their helper. And so what I'm going to do when I'm testing your code is I'm going to load your lab2.cl from another script and call all of the different functions, the OKJSUM, OKJList, that kind of thing. So no throwing the hash bang in your lab2.cl, no throwing all sorts of other extra garbage in it, just the four functions and whatever helper functions they rely on. So that's the idea. Again, I've thrown in a sample script test2.cl that loads it and does some sample calls, and you can do whatever you like to test2.cl. I'm not going to look at it. It's just there for, if you want to load and test your lab2.cl file and functions. So that's the idea. The usual process, the SSH CSCI fork and the git clone to get the repository, so it's lab 2 this time around, and the usual add commit push cycle to submit it before the deadline. So in terms of what's in that lab2.cl, so again, there's a bunch of comments describing kind of the format of those two sort of data representations. A job list, again, is just going to be a list of pairs. So we'll have some list where each element is a pair. And again, it's going to be employee and a job ID. The employee has to be a string, and the job ID is any non-negative integer. Empty list is considered valid, so an empty job list is valid. An empty pair wouldn't be, because we'd be missing the employee name and the job ID. And then again, the summary is the list of multiple jobs assigned to one person. So an employee name and, well, a list of these lists. So a list of, for a bunch of different people, here's the person, here's the jobs assigned to them. Here's the person, here's the jobs assigned to them. So that kind of an idea. And again, for that one, you have to have the employee name and you have to have at least one job, but multiple are fine. I'm not going to worry about duplicates in these. So if you happen to have a Shaggy 17 here and another Shaggy 17 somewhere down the road, or a Fred 17 somewhere down the road, that's fine. So we won't worry about duplicate names or duplicate job assignments. And I'm also not going to worry about the order of things. So when you're translating back and forth between the job list and the job summary, as long as if it's going from the job list to the summary, as long as it's got all of the right content for all of the right people, I don't care what order, whether it comes out with Shaggy first or Fred first or Daphne first, and I don't care what order the IDs are in for that individual, as long as all of the right IDs are in there and no wrong IDs are in there. So order is up to you. I'm not too fussed about that. And again, the 4 different functions are the one that checks if a job summary is valid. So again, that's this format with multiple jobs per person. One that checks if a job list is in the right format. So that's the list of pairs. One that converts from a list to a summary, right, returns the equivalent summary. One that takes the summary and returns an equivalent list of pairs. Right, so those are the 4 functions. And again, you can add helper functions if you need to. So the couple of restrictions, I think I've mentioned these. So no global variables, don't add anything, any global variables anywhere in your lab2.cl. Don't load other files from your lab2.cl. And you can add helper functions. You can't change the names or the parameter lists, you can't, let me correct that a little bit. You can't change the parameter lists except to add additional optional parameters. So if we want to throw in an accumulator and make this tail recursive, where you, add a so far and initialize it to nil or something like that. So that is permitted for these functions. You can add accumulators, but the functions still have to work correctly if the user makes the kind of expected call. If I call JSUM to list and pass it the job summary list, then it should work correctly. You can't require the user to provide additional parameters. So there's the idea. Let's see, I think those are all, the other spec was it's all got to be recursive, no loops for this one. So those were the restrictions. If you can make one or more of these tail recursive, that would be the ideal, right? It would be good practice, but I'm not going to make it a requirement. Again, use usual idea. We're all experienced programmers by this point, so do make sure you're following sound practices with respect to naming and comments and layout, but I'm not going to enforce specific standards for that. I don't want to, at this point, dive into suggested algorithms. Take a stab at the 4 of them. The error checking for the first 2, those should be natural recursive ones to get started with. The other 2, translating back and forth between them can be an interesting problem. So I would like you to take a stab at seeing if you can come up with a logic for it. If you do get stuck, I've thrown in a kind of a link to some suggestions on the approach I wound up using for the sample solutions. But take a stab at working out the logic yourself first and then see how it goes. So again, when you're going through and grabbing the repository, once you've grabbed it, you'll find that you've got a, sorry, the data.cl I just added a second ago. You won't have that one. You'll have the lab2.cl and the test2.cl. And again, the lab2.cl has got the descriptions of those two sort of data formats and skeletal versions of the 4 functions that at the moment don't do anything except return nil. And then that test2.cl, it just has some examples of going through, loading the lab2.cl, defining a few different data lists to use as test values. And so this is going through, again, you can do whatever you like in this. This was just an idea where I went through and said, okay, well, let's try some sample calls. Let's say, here's a data list that I'm going to try OKJlist on. So we'll set up this, and I think it's supposed to be valid. So I'm expecting OKJlist to return true. I'll call the function and then see if it returns what I expected. And if it doesn't, I'll print out a little error message saying, oh, I expected OKJlist to pass this, it didn't. So I've just got a few sample calls in here, and I would imagine that at the moment it fails pretty much everything. Oops. So yeah, this just goes through, tries to load the 2 of them, and runs the functions on different test cases and tells me if they passed or failed. Well, tells me if they failed, actually. So at the moment it's failing everything because, of course, the functions aren't really implemented. But that's the idea. So I will leave it there for now. And in this, make sure everybody gets kind of a stab at these. And maybe in the sessions next week, we'll talk a little bit about sort of some suggestions, some thoughts I have on specific algorithms if you're having troubles with those. All right, I will leave it there for now.